It is June 7th, 2017, and we've just landed at Krakow, Poland. And our trip leader from OAT, Anu Kivi, met us with her bright and cheery smile. Our fellow travelers were Bill, Jim and Beverly, Kathy and Dave, Marlene and Rick, Catherine and Helene, Shanaz, Diana just for the main, and we are Phoebe and Saul. Our first morning in Krakow, we took a city tour using golf carts, and we liked it much better than a bus. The former Pope John Paul II had been the Archbishop of Krakow. The Polish people loved him and called him Uncle. The Franciscan Brotherhood has been here in Krakow since 1238. Here is the Opera House. All of these buildings are in the style of the Habsburgs. This was the first building to be built in Krakow with modern safety features. Here we see the surviving portion of the original city's defensive wall. The main square of Krakow is huge, with St. Mary's Church right in the middle of it. Every hour, a window opens near the top of a spire of the basilica, and a trumpeter plays part of a traditional Polish anthem. The trumpet call has been used to warn people of impending danger, as well as for other purposes throughout Krakow's history. Collegium Maius, where much of the early research was done in human physiology. This is the castle or royal hill in Krakow, before and after Reconstruction. This was where the city of Krakow got started, and the headquarters of both the civil government and the church are located here. Seen from the top of the castle, this is the Vistula River, which runs through the city of Krakow. On Friday, June 9th, we continued the city tour by going to the Jewish ghetto area. Here, 18,000 Jews were pressed into a space for 3,000. So their fine homes could be made available to Nazis. These empty chairs are a monument to the ghetto. And the Poles were victims of the Nazis as well. Many were used as slave labor. Many were just murdered. Fully 50% of the Polish population was lost during the war, and over 6,000 were named as righteous Gentiles. Here was a pharmacist who exposed the truth of what the Nazis were doing and was later named a righteous Gentile. The story of Oskar Schindler is well known. The building that was Schindler's factory reopened in 2010 as a museum. And the story told there was not an easy one to have seen, heard, or remember. Just as the horror that was the Holocaust, endured by all the victims of the Nazis, must never be forgotten. We visited one of the 7 remaining synagogues in Krakow. As we left the area, it was good to know that after everything there is a Jewish community there now. After lunch, we went down into a 700-year-old salt mine. Support timbers are saturated with salt and petrified. Mining was very hard work, but they had horses to help. In those days, salt was an extremely valuable commodity and well worth the work. Saturday, June 10th, and we leave Krakow, destination Warsaw. First stop, Auschwitz. Well over 1,000 prisoners were forced into each of the buildings originally intended for 700. No heat, no plumbing. What was there was for show only. This place and all others like it had only one purpose. It is well known and well documented. Our next stop was in the town of Częstochowa. Each year, many thousands of people queue up on the streets to see this shrine and the Black Madonna. And from here, it's on to Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Here and in each capital of the Baltics, we see a building just like this, reminding even modern cities of past occupation and Russia's continuing threat. Krakow was relatively untouched during the war. Much of Warsaw, however, was destroyed by bombing, reconstruction creating a much more modern city, including this beautiful Leziensky Park, where later that day we attended a beautiful performance of Chopin's music. Little or no evidence can be seen today of the Warsaw Ghetto. Jews had been a valued part of Polish society for over 1,000 years. In the Poland Museum, it is said that there can be no history of the Jews without Poland, and that there can be no history of Poland without the Jews. As a reprisal for the Warsaw Uprising, the Germans destroyed the entire old city. Everything we saw here has been entirely reconstructed since the war. The insides of the buildings may be modern, but the exteriors are true to what they were before, with this building, the Royal Palace, being the last to be reconstructed. The pre-trip is over now. We've left Warsaw and flown to Vilnius, Lithuania. We'll begin to explore Vilnius tomorrow, but today we've discovered a bridge almost across the street from our hotel, leading to an experimental art incubator called in English the Independent Republic of Artists. The panels on this wall display their tongue-in-cheek constitution in languages from around the world. The purpose of this community, apparently, is to provide an atmosphere that will allow young artists to thrive and grow. We walk past two churches, both Catholic, built so close together that they look like one, but they're really separate, and continue on our walking tour of the old town. This teapot on the wall of this building is from the 16th century and has a map painted on it of what the city looked like at that time. This is the main square of the city of Vilnius and where it was founded back in the 1300s. This old palace was restored and is now a museum. We've arrived at the University of Vilnius in time for the graduation ceremony for the College of Theology. From the 1600s until the start of Nazi occupation, Jewish population in Vilnius grew to 40% of the total, 90% of which was lost during the Nazi occupation. Next, we visited Peter and Paul's Cathedral, famous for its beautiful sculptures. Then we had the rest of the day to ourselves. Phoebe and I chose to visit the remains of the castle on the hill and climbed to the top of the observation tower. Wednesday, June 14th begins with a trip outside of Vilnius to the Krakow Castle. It was built by the Grand Duke to be his residence, and whether by design or location it was considered unconquerable. The castle has been restored and is now a beautiful museum. Next we meet with some local Karaims, where we will participate in a cooking demonstration to make savory meat pastries called kabinas. As it turns out, what we made was Lithuanian empanadas. Very tasty. On our way back to Vilnius, our bus driver surprised us with a visit to his home and met his lovely wife. Our next stop was the KGB Museum, also known as the Museum of Genocide Victims. This was an anniversary of the deportation, and all day long the names of the victims were being read. These pictures, done by children, depict how those children saw the tragedy. Inside, the pictures on the walls showed clearly the horrors that the captives endured. June 15th, we leave Vilnius. First stop is Rumšiškės, to see a collection of rural dwellings and farmsteads from the 18th and 19th centuries, arranged in groupings according to the regions they're from. They even demonstrate the skills of daily living of the time they're showing. This would be typical of a Lithuanian city of the 1900s, with a population of about 2,000. Next we met Lena Vilkas, now in her mid-80s. But as a child of 14, she was ripped one night from her comfortable life and loaded aboard one of these rail wagons to endure a 3-month journey, never knowing where she was or where she was going. Finally arriving at a work camp on the Siberian Arctic coast, she survived many years of the harshest, most unspeakable conditions until a sympathetic Russian student helped her to escape. But to return home at that time would have meant immediately being shipped right back. So she remained hidden until the fall of the Soviet Union, finally returning home in 1992 to begin rebuilding her life. Our next stop was for lunch in the old city of Kaunas. After lunch it was back in the bus and on to Klaipėda. We got there early enough so that we could take a little walk around the old city, and came across some folks dancing in the streets. In the morning, we were off by bus to a fragile sand dune peninsula called the Koronian Spit. Here we walked the beach in the rain, searching for amber. But first we're going to visit the Hill of Witches, an outdoor gallery of wooden sculptures recalling some of the legends of Lithuania's pagan past. Lunch was a delightful experience, located with a view of the lagoon and operated by a couple with a beautiful story. She had a dream. She convinced a total stranger to invest in that dream. They fell in love, and the rest is history. Our last activity of the day was a visit to a local amber workshop. We learned about the history of amber, its value, and how it's processed into jewelry or works of art. In the morning, we're on our way to Riga, Latvia. Some say the tradition of planting crosses on this hill began in the 14th century. However, it has served as a place of peaceful resistance for Lithuanian Catholics, who use the site as a memorial to their fallen freedom fighters, and a way to stay connected to their roots and traditions during the long Soviet occupation. Anna, who became Tsarina of Russia later, lived in this castle for 10 years. This region, or duchy, was given her as a gift by Peter the Great when she married. This castle is the first, but not the last, example of conspicuous consumption on the part of Russia to be seen on this trip. Riga is the largest of the Baltic capitals, its 1 million inhabitants making up half the Latvian population. Sunday morning, June 18th, and we begin with a walk into the Art Nouveau district of the city. And when we get to the park, our bus is waiting for us. This leaning wall represents the Latvian Jews. The leaning pillars represent the many righteous Latvians, Christians, who helped the Jews any way they could. Many of them were killed, but most survived. This is the remains of the synagogue in Riga, where 300 Jews burned to death as the Nazi guards watched. This is City Hall and the city center of Old Town Riga. Remains of the old defensive wall appear from time to time between buildings. Black magic is a very old traditional drink in Latvia. Legend says it once cured Catherine the Great of an illness. We tried it. I didn't like it. This is the Lutheran Church of Riga. the main square of Riga's old city. Latvia's Parliament building. This is a monument to the barricades that existed during the Soviet occupation. This is the only active synagogue in Riga. This lovely waterway bisects the city. This morning we visit the Venagi family. We would call them entrepreneurs. They operate a winery and a small factory where they make wooden spoons and other wooden products. But to survive the long Soviet occupation, they had to appear as though they were not a threat to the state. They dressed very poorly, replaced the curtains in their windows with rags or blankets, hid any and all possessions of any apparent value, and appeared to be non-threatening or dumb. Now they are again entrepreneurs. Next we visited the home of a local family. Norman is a self-employed software consultant. This is the home he and his wife and mother-in-law share. They shared with us the difficulties that had been the Soviet occupation. They also shared the role that singing had played in the Baltic's winning of freedom, and glowed when they spoke of plans for their future. The meal was excellent. Getting to know these people, a priceless treasure. It is Tuesday, June 20th, and we're on our way to Tallin. We stopped at Cesis to see the well-preserved ruins of a 13th century castle built here by the Knights of the Sword. Some of us climbed the tower to get a better view. Our next stop was something called the bog, or the mire, a fairly large area of swampy ground, where a man could sink into the mud and probably not get out. But a soldier on horseback didn't have a chance. But local partisans knew where it was safe to step and where it wasn't. Wednesday morning, June 21st, we're in Tallin. The Estonian Song Festival is one of the largest amateur choral events in the world. Song is what held the Estonian people and their traditions together throughout their history. Song, along with other forms of protest, like the unbroken human chain of 1 million people demanding their freedom, stretching from Vilnius to Tallin, is what won the Baltics their freedom, coinciding with the fall of the Soviet Union. We've left our bus behind and we're doing a walking tour of the city. This is a Russian church built in 1900. Now we're in the Old Town, and this is the old St. Mary's Cathedral. The cathedral was built in the 14th century, but the belfry was added in the 1700s. A defensive wall was built around the entire original city. This is what remains. We've been walking in the upper town. Through this wall is the lower town. Cruise ships are in port, so the town square is a madhouse. And standing on top of the town hall, legend says, is an old soldier who is called Old Thomas, just watching it all. This is Tallin's Wall Street. It is Thursday, June 22nd, and we're using a tram for our excursion this morning. Our destination is a palace built by Peter the Great for Catherine. This is the President's Palace. Kumu is Estonia's modern museum of art. After the museum, we had some free time. Phoebe and I used it to visit the synagogue in Tallin and the Jewish Community Center next door. There are 3,000 Jews in Estonia, 1,500 in Tallin. 100 families are supporting members of the synagogue, but all 3,000 belong to the community center. June 23rd, and it's a long bus ride to St. Petersburg, even with stops. We arrive in St. Petersburg, check into our hotel, and immediately go for an orientation walk in the nearby area. Some buildings are waiting for repairs. In the past, people would wash their clothes in this canal. Anna surprised us by arranging for us to see the city by boat. There are many bridges over the rivers in this city. And this young man was waiting and waving at us from each of them. Here you can see him running along the river to get to the next bridge ahead of us. Peter and Paul's Cathedral, and the birthplace of St. Petersburg. This is the only mosque in the city. The Neva River connects to the Gulf of Finland. He's still with us. And sure enough, this very tired young man was there when we docked and got his reward. June 24th, and it's time to see the city of St. Petersburg. Apollo, the god of music, sits atop this opera house. The Church of Our Savior of the Spilled Blood. The Merchant's Arcade, outside and inside. The Museum of Art. The Stock Exchange. The Cathedral of Peter and Paul. We have here the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul, and their families, and the last Russian Tsar, as well as his family and household staff, all murdered together. And most famous of all, the Hermitage, founded by Catherine the Great in 1764, originally the Winter Palace, now joined by 4 more huge buildings, filled to overflowing with opulent displays of wealth. Sunday, June 25th. We see the Grand Synagogue of St. Petersburg. Built in the late 1800s, it's the second largest synagogue in Europe. St. Isaac's Cathedral. These icons are not painted, they're in mosaics. We're now at Catherine's Palace, sometimes called the Tsar's Village, and it is huge. Before we can go in, we have to put on these felt overshoes, I guess to protect the floors. The main trip is over now. Diana's going off on her own, but the rest of us are going on to Moscow, where we check into the Metropole Hotel, 5 stars, and just 1 block off of Red Square. The word red in Russian means beautiful. We are going into Red Square through that gate. This wall is the oldest structure in Red Square, and it is the external wall of the Kremlin itself. This cathedral consists of 10 different churches, each one consecrated after a battle had been won. The GUM is world famous. Once an open-air market, it now rivals the best high-end malls anywhere. These bronze ducks were a gift from First Lady Barbara Bush when she visited Moscow. Victory Park was finally built to commemorate the end of World War II. We visited the Tretyakov Gallery. And a gallery in a subway station. June 28th, it's our last day in Russia, and we are going inside the Kremlin walls, which is the same as inside the original city of Moscow. That was in 1147, and it was 75 acres. Napoleon actually did enter Moscow, but he didn't stay long, and when he left behind over 600 cannon. The Kremlin wall has 12 towers and 5 gates. Each tower is topped by a star with artificial rubies and weighs 1.5 tons. First Lenin lived here, then later Boris Yeltsin. This huge cannon was never intended to fire, only to frighten. We were told that this is the only square anywhere that is surrounded by 5 churches, each built to commemorate a war. I guess that's got to tell you something. This is the reception hall of the president. We toured the armory but could not take any pictures there. At our farewell dinner, Anu summarized where we'd been together.
And spent one day in Vilnius.
And later I asked her what has the freedom from the Soviets meant to her.
During the Soviet time, we lived like in the box, because they told us how we should think, what we should think, how we should live, where we should go, what we should do, and how we should do it. So even, for example, the simple choices for school, university, and living place after that, or job, it was not a free choice. And nowadays, now we are free. We have free choice, so I'm only responsible for my life. So that's what changed tremendously.
This trip was different than most, as we expected it would be. There were some heavy emotions to deal with, and yet it was fun too. What more could we ask?